Daniel Cooper smoothed his threadbare collar one last time, gripping his 6-year-old daughter Emma's hand as they entered the upscale coffee shop on Fifth Avenue, desperate and 23 days from eviction, praying the hiring manager would overlook the fact that he'd brought his child to a professional interview. He never noticed the distinguished Arab businessman in the tailored charcoal suit sitting at the adjacent table, his dark eyes cold and distant as he prepared to reject a multi-million-dollar humanitarian deal with 3 sweating American developers. Daniel couldn't have known that the austere stranger was Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid, a billionaire whose heart had been locked in grief for 3 years since his pregnant wife died, and whose carefully constructed walls of isolation would shatter completely in less than 20 minutes because of one Arabic phrase his daughter would speak, one worn teddy bear that would roll across polished marble, and one moment of innocent kindness that would alter the trajectory of 3 broken lives forever. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Daniel had woken at 4:30 that morning in the cramped studio apartment that smelled faintly of mildew and yesterday's pasta, his alarm barely necessary anymore, since worry had become a more reliable timekeeper than any clock. 2 years. It had been 2 years since Sarah died on that delivery table, her hand going slack in his, as the monitors flatlined. 2 years since he'd held his stillborn son for 17 minutes before the nurses gently took him away. 2 years since his entire world had collapsed into a single imperative: keep Emma safe, keep Emma fed, keep Emma loved. He'd worked the overnight shift at the warehouse, come home to sleep 3 hours, then risen to iron his only interview shirt, the one with the collar so frayed he'd carefully stitched it last night by lamplight, his fingers clumsy with the needle but determined. His shoes were 8 years old, the leather cracked along the sides, but he'd polished them until they caught the weak morning light streaming through their single window. Everything he owned told the same story written in worn fabric and faded colors. They'd had a house once, a 3-bedroom colonial with a yard where Emma took her first steps. But medical bills and funeral costs had devoured their savings like a wildfire consuming dry grass. He'd sold it, downsized again, each move taking them further from the life Sarah had dreamed for their family. Now they lived in 400 square feet with a bathroom down the hall and neighbors who fought at 2 in the morning, but Emma never complained because Daniel had taught her the only lesson that truly mattered. Kindness costs nothing, and dignity isn't measured in dollars. She sat on their second-hand sofa now, clutching Hope, the worn teddy bear with button eyes and patches on both arms. The last gift Sarah had given her before going to the hospital, that terrible November morning. The bear's fur had been rubbed thin from thousands of embraces, from being clutched during nightmares and held during lonely afternoons when Daddy was at his second job or his third. Today's interview was for a project manager position at a mid-sized construction firm. Decent salary, normal hours, benefits that included health insurance. Emma desperately needed for her asthma medication. It was his last realistic chance before the eviction notice on their counter became reality. 23 days. That's all they had. His sister was supposed to watch Emma, had promised yesterday. But she'd called at 6 this morning with a sick child of her own. Apologetic but unavailable. No backup plan. No other options. So Daniel had dressed Emma in her nicest outfit. The blue dress, with the white collar that was getting too small but still looked presentable, had braided her hair the way Sarah used to, and made the decision that might cost him everything. He'd bring her along, explain, apologize. Hope for understanding from a stranger who held their future in his hands. Emma looked up at him with Sarah's gray eyes, solemn and trusting, and asked if he was nervous. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and lied that everything would be fine. Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid sat with the stillness of carved marble at the corner table, his Brioni suit worth more than most people earned in 6 months, his Patek Philippe watch catching the afternoon light that filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's financial district. The documents before him were comprehensive, professionally prepared, filled with statistics and projections and photographs of struggling families who needed hope. He studied them with eyes that registered information but felt nothing. The way a computer processes data without comprehension of its meaning. Across from him, 3 American businessmen shifted in their seats, their desperation palpable in the air, like humidity before a storm. Michael Torres, the lead developer, had already loosened his tie twice. His partners, David Chen and Robert Fitzgerald, kept glancing at each other with looks that said they knew this meeting was slipping away from them. They'd been talking for 30 minutes, their voices growing more urgent as they pitched their community development project. Affordable housing units for working families, a charter school focused on underserved children, a medical center offering sliding-scale care for those without insurance. It was exactly the kind of humanitarian investment that Omar's late wife would have championed, would have begged him to fund without hesitation. Layla had believed in these things with a passion that had once inspired him, back when he could still feel inspiration, back when the world held color instead of this endless gray. His assistant, Rashid, leaned close and whispered that these men had flown in from Seattle specifically for this meeting, had spent months preparing their proposal, had been waiting 4 months just to get on Omar's calendar. This information was meant to encourage consideration, to remind Omar of the effort involved, but it landed on him like rain on stone, acknowledged but unable to penetrate. 3 years. Layla had been gone for 3 years, dead at 31, while 7 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they'd planned to name Amira. He'd held Layla's hand as she coded on the operating table. An amniotic embolism, the doctors said. Rare and catastrophic and utterly random. They'd tried to save the baby. Had performed an emergency cesarean, but Amira had been without oxygen too long. He'd never heard her cry, never seen her eyes open. He'd buried his wife and daughter in the same casket, and something fundamental inside him had been buried alongside them. The Sheikh Omar who'd laughed easily, who'd believed in the goodness of humanity, who'd seen wealth as a responsibility to lift others, that man had died too. What remained was this shell, this automaton who attended meetings and signed documents and moved through each day with mechanical precision but no purpose. Money meant nothing when you couldn't spend it on the people you loved. Power meant nothing when you couldn't protect those who mattered most. He'd accumulated billions, and none of it could buy back a single moment with Layla's hand in his or the chance to hold his daughter just once. Michael Torres was making his final appeal now, his voice cracking slightly with emotion as he described the single mothers who'd benefit from affordable childcare, the families one medical emergency away from homelessness. It was compelling. It was worthy. Omar could see that objectively, the way he could see that the sky was blue or that coffee was hot, but he felt nothing stirring in his chest. No connection to these strangers' suffering, no desire to be part of their solution. He was about to speak the words of rejection, polite but final, when movement caught his peripheral vision. Michael Torres leaned forward, his hands clasped almost in prayer, and made his final, desperate appeal. Sheikh Al-Rashid, I know you've heard hundreds of pitches, but this isn't just about return on investment. It's about single parents working 2 or 3 jobs who can't afford both rent and food. It's about children who deserve stability, families who are one crisis away from losing everything. Your funding could give them a chance, could break cycles of poverty that trap generations. David Chen added quietly, We've identified 217 families in immediate need. Parents who are trying, who are working themselves to exhaustion, who just need someone to believe in them. Robert Fitzgerald placed a photograph on the table, a single mother with 2 children standing in front of a condemned apartment building. This could be their future, but only if someone with the resources and vision decides that their lives matter. Omar looked at the photograph with eyes that might as well have been looking at abstract art, seeing shapes and colors, but no meaning, no connection to the flesh and blood humans it represented. His face remained perfectly composed, carved from stone. betraying nothing of the emptiness that had consumed him from the inside out. He drew breath to speak, to deliver the rehearsed rejection that began with appreciation for their time and ended with his regrets, when something small and worn tumbled across his field of vision. A teddy bear, faded brown with button eyes and visible patches, dropped from small hands at a table 15 feet away and rolled across the polished marble floor with a soft tumbling sound that somehow cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop. The bear rolled and rolled, propelled by momentum and gravity, past other tables, past the legs of chairs, coming to rest precisely against Omar's right shoe, the handmade Italian leather, a stark contrast to the worn synthetic fur. At the table behind the Americans, Daniel Cooper was speaking nervously to a man in a blue blazer, his voice low and apologetic, explaining about his daughter, about the emergency, about his qualifications, completely unaware that his child had moved. Emma slid off her chair with the hesitant movements of a naturally shy child entering the space of intimidating adults. She was small for 6, thin in the way children of poverty often are, her blue dress clean but clearly outgrown, her braided hair coming loose at the ends. She walked slowly toward Omar's table, her eyes down, her steps uncertain, but determined because hope was everything. Hope was Mama's last gift. She reached the cluster of tables just as Omar opened his mouth to speak his rejection, just as the 3 American businessmen were bracing for disappointment. The bear lay against his shoe like an accusation or perhaps a plea. Emma looked up slowly, her gray eyes traveling up the expensive suit, up to the face of this tall, imposing stranger whose very presence seemed to demand deference. And there, in his dark eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch, something she recognized with the uncanny wisdom children sometimes possess. She saw the same sadness that lived in her daddy's eyes late at night when he sat alone in their tiny kitchen, staring at Mama's photograph. The sadness that came from missing someone so much your whole body hurt. This stranger's eyes held that exact same grief, that identical emptiness dressed up in expensive clothes. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible, and bent down to retrieve her bear. Omar froze completely, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass struck by a hammer. The teddy bear at his feet was not just worn but loved, transformed by years of small hands, clutching it through nightmares and lonely afternoons, through grief that no child should have to carry. He could see every detail with sudden, painful clarity. The patches sewn inexpertly over holes, one arm slightly flatter than the other from being held too tight. The faded brown fur that had once been rich chocolate but now looked sun-bleached and thin. One button eye hung slightly loose, and there was a spot on the bear's chest where the fabric had been rubbed completely smooth, worn away by what must have been thousands of embraces. The bear triggered something deep in his memory, something he'd locked away behind steel doors in his mind. The nursery, the room he'd spent 3 months preparing, painting the walls himself in soft yellow, assembling the crib with his own hands, hanging the mobile with stars and moons that Layla had chosen, the stuffed animals he'd arranged on shelves, waiting for small hands that would never reach for them. He'd locked that door the day after the funeral and hadn't opened it since. Emma picked up her bear and hugged it fiercely against her chest. The way drowning people clutch life preservers, the way the bereaved clutch photographs. She looked up at Omar again with those knowing gray eyes, and something in her child's wisdom recognized a fellow traveler in grief's long journey. She spoke softly, her pronunciation careful and practiced, in Arabic that was accented but clear. "Mama taras alea min al-sama." Mama watches over me from heaven. The world stopped. Time itself seemed to stumble and fall. Those words, that exact phrase, was what Omar's grandmother had taught him to say when his own mother died of cancer when he was 7 years old. It had been his private comfort, his secret reassurance whispered into the darkness of his childhood bedroom. He'd said it every night for years, and then again after Layla died, trying to find the same solace but finding only emptiness. And now this American child, this small girl in an outgrown dress, was speaking his language. His grief, his most intimate comfort, as though she'd reached directly into his heart and pulled out the words living there. He stared at her, unable to speak, unable to move, his mind trying to process the impossibility of this moment. The three businessmen had gone silent, sensing something profound occurring but not understanding it. Kaif Tarif Ali Arabia? Omar heard himself ask, his voice cracking on the last word, his decades of composure crumbling. How do you know Arabic? His hands were trembling. He realized with distant shock that his eyes were burning with tears he hadn't shed in 3 years. Emma switched between Arabic and English, her words halting but earnest, her small voice carrying the weight of a story she'd told herself 1,000 times to keep her mother alive in memory. Mama kanat tatailam al-Arabia, she began, then switched to English when the Arabic failed her. My mama was learning Arabic before she went to heaven. She had a friend, Miss Nadia, who taught her. Mama said she wanted to understand different people, different cultures. She clutched hope tighter, finding courage in the worn fur. I found Mama's notebooks in a box when I was 4. Daddy keeps them on the shelf. They have words written funny, with English letters so Mama could read them. Her pronunciation of the phonetic method was careful, practiced. Daddy helps me practice every night before bed because it makes me feel close to Mama, like she's teaching me even though she's not here. Omar listened with an intensity that made the air around them feel charged, electric. His tears hadn't fallen, but they balanced on the edge of his lashes, defying gravity through sheer force of will. I only know a few phrases, Emma admitted, looking down at her bear. But this one was Mama's favorite. She wrote it with a heart next to it in her notebook. She looked back up at Omar and said in clear English, "My Mama said if we learn each other's words, we learn each other's hearts." The simple profundity of it struck Omar like a physical blow. That was Layla's philosophy exactly. Her belief that language was a bridge. That understanding began with the willingness to speak in another's tongue. Daniel's voice suddenly cut through the moment, sharp with panic. "Emma! Emma! I'm so sorry." He appeared at Omar's table, his face flushed with mortification, reaching for his daughter's hand. "I'm so sorry. Sir? Sirs?" She must have wandered off. I was just. His eyes darted between Omar and the businessmen, recognizing expensive suits and important faces, understanding that his daughter had interrupted something significant. "Please excuse us, Emma. Come now. I'm so sorry." He was already calculating that the interview was lost, that he'd disturbed powerful people, that his desperation had led to career suicide. Omar raised one hand, a gesture of absolute authority that froze everyone at the table. The Americans went silent mid-breath. He looked at Daniel with eyes that were suddenly seeing instead of merely observing, taking in the frayed collar stitched with care, the polished but cracked shoes, the exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been running on empty for too long. But he also saw the dignity there, the careful grooming, the protective way he held his daughter's shoulder. "Your daughter speaks Arabic," Omar said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite conceal. Daniel's face flushed deeper, embarrassment warring with the protective instinct to shield his daughter from judgment. "I'm sorry. I should explain. My wife, Sarah, she was taking Arabic lessons. Before she died, she was fascinated by the culture, the language, the history." His voice caught slightly on the past tense, the way it always did when speaking of Sarah to strangers. She had a friend from college, a woman from Lebanon, and they'd meet for coffee twice a week. Sarah loved learning about different cultures, different ways of seeing the world. He glanced down at Emma, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. She died before Emma's 2nd birthday. Complications during childbirth with our 2nd child. We lost them both. The words came out flat, rehearsed from having to explain his tragedy too many times to social workers and school administrators and potential employers. Emma found Sarah's notebooks about 2 years ago and she became obsessed with them. She wanted to know what Mama was learning, wanted to understand the words Mama had written. Daniel's voice grew softer, more tender. I bought some children's Arabic books, found free lessons online. We practiced together every night before bed. It's our special time, our way of keeping Sarah alive, keeping her dreams alive. He was already trying to usher Emma away, his hand gentle but firm on her shoulder. Again, I apologize for the interruption. It won't happen again. Come on, sweetheart. These gentlemen are busy. But Omar's hand rose again, and this time his voice carried a different quality, something almost pleading beneath the authority. Please, sit. The single word landed like a thunderclap in the quiet space. Michael Torres and his partners exchanged bewildered glances, their pitch forgotten, their confusion palpable. Rashid, Omar's assistant, actually took a step backward, his eyes widening with shock. In 15 years of service, he had never seen the sheikh invite a stranger into his private space, let alone a stranger with a child who'd interrupted a critical business meeting. Omar gestured to empty chairs at the adjacent table, pulling them closer with movements that seemed almost desperate. Daniel hesitated, his survival instincts screaming that something important was happening, but his mind unable to process what or why. He looked at the hiring manager he'd been interviewing with, saw the man's stunned expression, and made a decision based purely on the intensity in Omar's dark eyes. He sat. Emma climbed onto the chair beside him, her legs too short to reach the floor. Hope the bear clutched against her chest. She looked between her father's confused face and the tall stranger whose eyes were now glistening with unshed tears, whose composure had cracked open to reveal something raw and wounded and human underneath. Omar leaned forward slightly, his entire attention focused on Emma with an intensity that made the busy coffee shop fade into irrelevance. Ma aladi kala daftar, mlahazat umik aidana, he asked in Arabic. What else did your mama's notebook say? Emma's face scrunched in concentration. Her small voice careful as she recited the phrase she'd practiced with her father hundreds of times. Al-lutf luka yafahamuha al-jami. Then in English, to make sure he understood. Kindness is a language everyone understands. Omar's eyes closed as though struck, his breath leaving him in a rush. Layla had said almost those exact words, had written them in the mission statement for her foundation, had whispered them to him in their last conversation before surgery. Love and kindness transcend every language, she'd said, her hand on her swollen belly. The echo across time and grief was too precise to be coincidence, too perfect to be anything but the universe. Insisting he pay attention, he opened his eyes, focusing on the teddy bear. Emma clutched like a talisman. Your bear, he said softly in English. What is its name? Emma held Hope up slightly, presenting her properly. Her name is Hope. Mama gave her to me and said that even when things are hard, even when we're sad, we have to have hope. That's what Daddy tells me every night. She looked at Daniel with absolute trust, with love so pure it made Omar's chest ache. Daniel watched this surreal interaction with growing confusion and worry, unable to understand why this obviously important Arab businessman was speaking to his daughter with such raw emotion, why tears were threatening to spill from eyes that had been cold and distant moments ago. Omar turned to Daniel, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but gentle. What is your name? Daniel cleared his throat. Daniel Cooper, sir. I'm here for an interview. Project manager position. Omar glanced at the community development documents spread before him, then at Daniel's worn but clean clothes, then at Emma clutching Hope, then back to the documents. The pieces were assembling themselves in his mind, like a puzzle revealing a picture he'd been too blind to see. What do you know about community development? Daniel hesitated, wondering if this was some kind of test, some strange tangent from a powerful man. I know construction, project management. I worked my way through college, managed commercial builds for 7 years. High-rises, mixed-use developments. His voice dropped. Before my wife died. After that, I had to take whatever work kept food on the table. Warehouses, delivery driving, night shifts, whatever gave me time with Emma. Michael Torres exchanged bewildered glances with his partners, their carefully prepared pitch abandoned, their confusion mounting with every passing second. They could sense something profound shifting in the air, some transformation occurring in the sheikh who'd been carved from ice moments ago, but they couldn't comprehend its source or meaning. Omar turned to them with a gesture that was both apologetic and absolute. "Gentlemen, please, step aside briefly. I need a moment." They rose uncertainly, moving to a table across the room, whispering among themselves, wondering if this strange interruption had somehow saved or destroyed their deal. Omar's full attention returned to Daniel, and when he spoke, there was no judgment in his voice, only genuine curiosity. "Why did you bring your child to an interview?" The question, asked with such simple directness, shattered Daniel's carefully maintained defenses. His shoulders sagged as though strings had been cut, exhaustion flooding his features. "I have an eviction notice. 23 days left. I work 3 jobs, but it's not enough. It's never enough. My sister was supposed to watch Emma, but her son got sick, and she called this morning, and I had no backup plan." The words tumbled out faster now, a dam breaking. "I know bringing her was probably career suicide. But I had no choice. I never leave Emma alone. After Sarah died, after I lost everything else, I promised myself Emma would never doubt she was loved, never doubt she was my priority." His voice cracked. "She's all I have." Emma looked up at her father, then at Omar, and added with the solemn wisdom of children who've known loss too early, "All we have is each other." Omar sat in silence for a long moment, his mind suddenly flooded with memories that had been locked behind steel doors for 3 years. Layla's laugh, bright and unrestrained, filling their penthouse with joy. Her passionate speeches about social responsibility, about using their wealth to lift others, about the obligation that came with privilege. Her hand on her swollen belly, talking about their daughter, about the world they'd build for her. And then the hospital, the machines screaming, her hand going weak in his, but her eyes still bright, still trying to give him something to hold on to. "Promise me," she'd whispered with her last coherent breath. "Promise me you'll keep your heart open. Don't let grief make you hard." He'd failed that promise. He'd locked his heart away, buried it with her and Amira, built walls so high that nothing could reach him. No plea for help, no suffering stranger, no worthwhile cause. He'd become exactly what she'd feared. Hard, closed, dead inside even while his body kept functioning. Until this moment. Until a child's Arabic phrase and a worn teddy bear named Hope had somehow breached walls he'd thought impenetrable. Omar made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. Clarity cutting through 3 years of fog like lightning through darkness. He gestured to the Americans, who returned quickly, their faces tight with anxiety. "I'm approving your project," Omar said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd rediscovered his purpose. "Full funding. You'll have my commitment in writing by end of business tomorrow." Michael Torres's face went slack with shock before splitting into a grin of pure disbelief. David Chen actually gasped. Robert Fitzgerald started to speak. Stopped, then tried again. "Sheikh Al-Rashid, we're incredibly grateful, but I have conditions." Omar continued, his tone brooking no negotiation. "I want Daniel Cooper as your project manager." He gestured to Daniel, still sitting beside Emma. "This man. He runs the project. Non-negotiable." The American's joy faltered into confusion. Michael Torres glanced at Daniel, clearly not recognizing him, then back at Omar. "I'm sorry. We don't. Who is?" "He's sitting right here," Omar said calmly. "And if you want my funding, this is non-negotiable. Daniel Cooper manages the project, reports directly to me, and has full authority over implementation." Daniel shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. "Wait, I don't, sir. I haven't been interviewed. You don't know my qualifications. I don't understand what's happening." Omar looked at him steadily, and there was something ancient and knowing in his dark eyes. Something that had been dead and was now awakening. You've been interviewed by someone far wiser than these men, far wiser than me. My decision is made. Emma beamed from her chair, clutching hope, understanding in the way children sometimes do that something wonderful and impossible was occurring. The Americans exchanged rapid glances, their desperation for funding overriding their confusion. Michael Torres spoke quickly. If Sheikh Al-Rashid insists, then absolutely. We'll need to do paperwork, background checks. But yes, of course. If that's your condition, Mr. Cooper is our project manager. Omar reached into his jacket and produced a business card of heavy cream stock with embossed lettering. He handed it to Daniel, whose hand trembled as he accepted it. My office. Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Rashid will have the contracts ready. Daniel stared at the card. At the name Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid. At the address of a building he'd only seen from the outside. His eyes were burning, tears threatening to spill. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem. Omar shook his head, his own eyes still glistening. Don't thank me. Thank your daughter and your wife. His voice broke slightly on the last word. They reminded me of something I'd forgotten, something I needed to remember. That evening in their tiny apartment with its peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture, Daniel moved through the motions of dinner preparation in a daze, his mind still trying to process the impossible events of the afternoon. He boiled water for spaghetti, Emma's favorite. A meal he could actually afford to make special by adding real Parmesan cheese he'd splurged on from the corner store. Emma sat at their small table, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor, chattering happily about the nice man who liked her Arabic, who had kind eyes, even though he looked sad like Daddy sometimes looked sad. Daniel listened while stirring the pasta, his eyes drifting repeatedly to Sarah's photograph on the wall, the one where she was laughing at something outside the frame. Her hair catching sunlight, so alive and vibrant it hurt to look at sometimes. Beside the photo on the shelf sat her 3 Arabic notebooks, spiral-bound and worn, filled with her careful handwriting and phonetic pronunciations. Daddy, do you think Mama saw what happened today? Emma asked, around a mouthful of spaghetti. Daniel sat across from her, his own plate forgotten. I think Mama sees everything you do, sweetheart. And I think she would be so proud of you today. Emma twirled pasta on her fork thoughtfully. Can we keep practicing Arabic? I want to learn more words. Maybe more words about hope and kindness. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Always. We'll practice every single night, I promise. After dinner, he ran a bath in their shared hallway bathroom, helped Emma into her pajamas printed with faded stars, and braided her hair the way Sarah had taught him in those precious weeks before she died. He read her a story, watched as her gray eyes grew heavy, as she clutched hope against her chest the way she'd done every night for 4 years. He sat beside her narrow bed long after she'd fallen asleep, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, allowing himself for the first time in months to believe that things might actually be okay. The eviction notice on the kitchen counter suddenly seemed less like an executioner's blade and more like a problem with a solution. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building whose lights reflected off the East River, Omar stood at floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. He held a framed photograph of Layla in traditional dress from their wedding, her smile radiant, her hand reaching toward the camera as though reaching for him across the gulf of death. I heard you today, he whispered to the image, his breath fogging the glass slightly. Through a child's voice, speaking your words, your beliefs, your heart. I'm sorry I forgot. I'm sorry I closed myself off the way you begged me not to. He set the photo down gently and turned toward the locked door at the end of the hallway, the room he hadn't entered in 3 years. It was time. Time to open the nursery. Time to remember that grief and love were inseparable. Time to honor Layla and Amira, not by hiding from the world, but by rejoining it. The next morning, Daniel and Emma stood on the sidewalk outside Al-Rashid Enterprises, staring up at 40 stories of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the sky itself. the building's mirrored surface reflecting clouds and morning light in a display of wealth that made their worn clothes feel even more inadequate. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with a fountain in the center and modern art on the walls worth more than Daniel had earned in 5 years. Emma squeezed her father's hand tightly, suddenly shy in this temple of affluence where even the air seemed expensive. They approached the reception desk, where a woman in a designer suit looked at them with barely concealed skepticism, her eyes taking in Daniel's best shirt that was still obviously cheap and Emma's too small dress with its careful patches. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to summon confidence. "I have an appointment with Sheikh Al-Rashid. Daniel Cooper." The skepticism deepened. "I don't see." "Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid specifically requested Mr. Cooper's presence this morning," Daniel said, his voice firmer now, drawing on reserves of dignity that poverty couldn't erase. The receptionist's expression transformed instantly, her eyes widening. She typed rapidly, spoke into a headset, then stood so quickly her chair rolled backward. "Of course, Mr. Cooper. Please, right this way. The Sheikh's assistant will meet you on the executive floor." They were suddenly treated like dignitaries, escorted to private elevators with polished brass and soft lighting, whisked upward while classical music played softly overhead. The doors opened directly into a reception area where Rashid waited, his smile genuine and warm. "Mr. Cooper, Emma, welcome. Sheikh Al-Rashid sends his regards. Daniel, you'll be meeting with our legal team to finalize employment contracts, review benefits packages, sign necessary documentation." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Emma. "What about my daughter?" "She can wait in the Sheikh's private lounge," Rashid said smoothly, gesturing to a door off the main reception. "There are books, toys, comfortable seating. The Sheikh specifically requested she be made comfortable." Daniel felt uncomfortable separating from Emma in this strange place. But Rashid's assurance was absolute. "It's perfectly safe, I promise. The Sheikh himself will check on her." Emma looked up at her father with trust in her gray eyes. "It's okay, Daddy. I have hope." She clutched her bear tighter. Daniel kissed her forehead and allowed himself to be led toward a conference room filled with people in expensive suits. Emma was guided to the lounge, a room with soft carpet and walls lined with books. She'd just settled into a chair with a picture book when the door opened. Omar entered, still imposing in his tailored suit, but his eyes were softer today. "Marhaba," he said in Arabic. "Hello, again." Emma looked up, recognizing him, and responded carefully in Arabic. "Marhaba, Saidi." "Hello, sir." Omar sat in the chair across from her, and his voice was gentle when he asked, "May I show you something?" Omar stood, extending his hand to Emma, and she took it without hesitation, her small fingers disappearing into his palm as he led her down a private hallway she hadn't noticed before, away from the main office spaces, past abstract paintings and floor-to-ceiling windows, toward a door at the end that looked somehow different from the others, as though it carried weight beyond wood and hinges. He stopped before it, his hand on the knob, and for a moment seemed unable to turn it, frozen by whatever lay beyond. Then he drew a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and painful, and opened it slowly. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light, and as Omar flipped the switch, Emma saw a nursery that belonged in a fairy tale. All soft yellows and creams, with a crib of dark cherry wood and a rocking chair positioned near the window. But everything was covered in white dust sheets that made the furniture look like ghosts, like memories that had been carefully preserved but not allowed to live. A mobile hung motionless above the crib, stars and moon suspended in stillness. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something like time passing in a sealed room. "I made this for my baby," Omar said in English, his voice barely above a whisper. "I painted the walls myself. My wife chose every detail, the mobile, the books, the color of the curtains." He stepped into the room as though entering a sacred space, his movements reverent and pained. "But my baby and my wife went to heaven before the baby was born. I locked this door 3 years ago, and haven't opened it since. Emma looked around with those knowing gray eyes, seeing not just a nursery but a monument to loss. A shrine to dreams that died before they could breathe. She walked to Omar and took his hand again. This small gesture of comfort from a child who understood grief in ways most adults never would. "Like my mama and baby brother," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her own tragedy. "Mama died having him, and the baby too. I was only 4, but I remember the sadness. I remember Daddy holding me at the hospital, crying so hard his whole body shook." Omar knelt down to her level, his expensive suit pressing against the dusty floor, his eyes searching hers. "Your brother," Emma nodded solemnly. "His name was going to be Thomas, Daddy told me later, but he went to heaven with Mama." She leaned closer and whispered as though sharing a secret. "Daddy cries at night. He sits in the kitchen looking at Mama's picture. But he doesn't know, I hear." Omar felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he'd built from grief and anger crumbling under the gentle assault of shared understanding. "I cry too," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Every night I stand at my window and talk to my wife's photograph. I tell her about my day, about how empty everything feels. Something profound passed between them in that dusty nursery, grief recognizing itself across the divide of age and culture and circumstance, honoring itself in the only language that truly matters, the language of hearts that have been broken and are still beating." Emma looked at the dust-covered furniture and asked, "Can I help you take down the sheets? It's too pretty to be covered up. Maybe you need hope too." And Omar, who had been frozen for 3 years in an endless winter of loss, broke completely under the simple kindness of a child's wisdom. They spent an hour together in that sacred space, carefully removing dust covers like archaeologists uncovering precious artifacts. Each piece of furniture revealing itself as Omar had left it 3 years ago, frozen in time and hope. Emma folded each sheet with the careful concentration children bring to important tasks, chattering in her unself-conscious way about her mama, sharing stories Daniel had told her about Sarah's laugh that sounded like bells, about how she made pancakes shaped like animals, about her dream of traveling the world and understanding different people. Omar listened while opening curtains, letting morning light flood the room for the first time in 1,000 days, and found himself sharing memories he'd locked away with the same care. He told Emma about Layla's laugh that could fill an entire room, about her passionate speeches at dinner parties, about social responsibility, about how she'd talk to her belly every night, telling their daughter about the world she'd inherit, promising to teach her kindness and courage. They discovered the mobile together, wrapped carefully in tissue paper in a drawer beneath the crib, stars and moons of silver and gold suspended on nearly invisible wire. Emma gasped with delight. "My mama loved stars. She said they were holes in heaven where people could peek through to watch us." Omar's hands trembled as he unwrapped it, as he climbed on a chair to hang it from the hook he'd installed himself 3 years ago. They watched it spin slowly in the air current, casting tiny shadows that danced across yellow walls. And something unspoken but profound was happening between them, a healing that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with shared presence in grief. Emma asked suddenly, with the directness only children possess, "Do you have any friends?" Omar climbed down from the chair, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. "I pushed everyone away after Layla died. I thought being alone hurt less. Daddy did that too," Emma said wisely. "But his friend Mr. Peterson kept bringing us soup every week. Chicken noodle. Now they play chess sometimes on Thursdays. Maybe you need a soup friend." The phrase was so perfectly absurd and perfectly true that Omar laughed, actually laughed, a sound rusty from disuse but genuine, bubbling up from somewhere he'd thought was dead. Emma beamed at the sound, proud to have brought joy to this sad man with kind eyes. When they returned to the lounge, Daniel was waiting, contract signed, his face a mixture of overwhelm and concern about where his daughter had disappeared to. Omar placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Everything is fine, Daniel. Better than fine." Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into the project, with an intensity born of purpose rediscovered. Working 12-hour days, not from desperation, but from genuine passion. The community development was challenging and complex, requiring coordination between architects, contractors, city planning departments, and community stakeholders. But he was capable and deeply invested. The project would create 80 units of affordable housing, a charter school focused on children from low-income families, and a medical clinic offering sliding-scale care. It was everything he'd wished had existed when he was drowning. When one medical emergency or missed paycheck would have destroyed them completely. Omar observed from what he told himself was a professional distance. Reviewing reports and attending occasional meetings, consistently impressed by Daniel's integrity and work ethic. The man was meticulous, honest with timelines and budgets, and genuinely cared about the families who would benefit. But there was more to Omar's involvement than professional oversight. Something his staff noticed with bewildered whispers. The sheikh was checking in on the project personally, something he never did, visiting construction sites and attending community meetings that were far beneath his usual level of engagement. The truth, which Omar barely admitted to himself, was that he wanted to see Emma. Daniel often brought her to site visits when school was out, unable to afford consistent childcare on his transitional salary. She charmed the construction workers with her fearless questions, asked the architects why buildings didn't fall down, and practiced her broken Arabic with anyone patient enough to listen. Omar found himself scheduling site visits around her presence, arriving when he knew she'd be there, bringing her books in Arabic, teaching her new phrases while Daniel reviewed blueprints. They developed an unlikely friendship that defied every convention. The grieving billionaire and the curious 6-year-old, finding in each other something both desperately needed. She showed him her mama's notebook during lunch breaks, the pages worn from small fingers, tracing Sarah's handwriting. He taught her phrases about courage and perseverance, about how storms pass and flowers grow again. They talked about missing people, about how love doesn't end when someone dies, but transforms into something that lives inside you forever. They discussed why kindness matters even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Emma told him about her baby brother Thomas, about how she sometimes talked to him and Mama at night. Omar told her about Amira, about the daughter he never got to hold, and found that speaking her name aloud didn't destroy him. It hurt. But it was the sad, happy Emma had described, pain mixed with the sweetness of love remembered. Daniel watched this unlikely friendship develop with emotions he couldn't quite name, gratitude tangled with confusion, joy mixed with a protective instinct he couldn't suppress. Emma talked about Omar constantly, about the sheikh who understood sad happy, who knew what it felt like to miss someone forever. Daniel was grateful for the job, for the stability, for the opportunity to do meaningful work. But this growing bond between his daughter and a billionaire felt precarious, like something that could shatter and leave Emma heartbroken. One evening, Omar invited them to dinner at his home. Daniel wanted to refuse, felt it was inappropriate, blurring professional boundaries in ways that made him uncomfortable. But Emma's excitement was so pure and radiant that he couldn't bring himself to disappoint her. They arrived at the penthouse as the sun set over Manhattan, the entire top floor with views that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful, sleek, and modern, with expensive art and furniture that belonged in magazines. But Emma noticed immediately what Daniel had been too overwhelmed to see. "Where are your pictures?" she asked, looking around at walls that were elegant but impersonal, devoid of photographs or personal mementos. Omar paused, caught off guard. "I put them away. After Layla died, it hurt too much to see her face everywhere." Emma looked at him with an expression that was somehow both childlike and ancient. "That's silly," she said with her mother's boldness. "If you hide them, you forget the happy parts. Daddy has Mama's pictures everywhere. In the kitchen, in my room, on his nightstand. It makes him sad happy." Omar knelt to her level, genuinely curious. "Like when something hurts but also feels good because you remember love," Emma explained, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "When I look at Mama's picture, my chest feels tight and my eyes get wet. But I also feel warm because I remember her hugs. That's sad happy. Omar was struck silent, this child having articulated in simple words what he'd been unable to express in 3 years of grief. Over dinner, pizza at Emma's enthusiastic request, which greatly amused Omar's chef, who was accustomed to preparing haute cuisine. They talked. Really talked. Daniel shared his journey through loss, the nights he'd considered giving up, the way Emma had kept him tethered to life. Omar shared his own descent into isolation, the way he'd built walls so high nothing could reach him. Two widowers from completely different worlds, discovering they shared the same grief, the same struggle to keep living when the person who made life meaningful was gone. The project neared completion as autumn painted the city in shades of amber and gold, rising from bare earth into something beautiful and functional. Everything the community desperately needed. 80 apartments with real kitchens and safe playgrounds, a school with bright classrooms and a library, a medical clinic staffed with doctors who understood that dignity mattered as much as treatment. Daniel had done exceptional work, bringing it in on budget and ahead of schedule. And even the city inspectors who'd arrived expecting problems had left impressed. The grand opening was planned for the first Saturday in November, with city officials and community members and press coverage that would showcase what compassion looked like when given resources and vision. But Daniel's transformation went beyond professional success. The generous salary Omar had insisted on, well above market rate, had slowly rebuilt their life. They'd moved to a 2-bedroom apartment with working heat and a kitchen Emma could help cook in, walls that didn't have water stains, a building where neighbors smiled instead of avoiding eye contact. Emma had new clothes that fit, books that weren't from library sales, an inhaler prescribed by a real doctor instead of rationed from free clinics. There was food in the fridge, always, and the absence of eviction notices felt like a miracle Daniel noticed every single day. More importantly, he'd found purpose again, work that mattered, that would help families like his avoid the desperation he'd known. But something else was happening that had nothing to do with construction timelines or salary deposits. Omar had transformed so completely his staff whispered about it in break rooms, comparing the cold, distant Sheikh of a year ago to this engaged, present man who sometimes smiled in meetings. He'd reopened Layla's foundation, restructured it to focus on single parents and families in crisis. Hired staff passionate about the mission. He'd invited old friends back into his life, hosting dinners he'd avoided for 3 years. The nursery was no longer a shrine, but a living room where he and Emma read together when she visited, where they practiced Arabic, surrounded by the hope Layla had built into every detail. Omar had restored Layla's photographs throughout the penthouse, her smile greeting him from the hallway, her laughter captured in frames beside the kitchen. He talked to her still, but now with gratitude instead of apology, telling her about his day, about the project, about the little girl with gray eyes and a worn teddy bear who'd taught him that hope wasn't foolish but essential. The night before the grand opening, Omar invited Daniel and Emma to the penthouse, his voice on the phone carrying an unusual nervousness that made Daniel agree despite sensing this was more than a casual dinner. They arrived to find the dining room set formally, candles flickering, the table laden with dishes Omar's chef had prepared with obvious care. Emma wore her nicest dress, the new one Daniel had been able to buy, and chatted happily through dinner about the grand opening tomorrow, about all the families who'd have homes. But Omar was quiet, distracted, his eyes holding something heavy and unspoken. After dinner, he brought them to his study, a room Daniel had never entered, lined with books and photographs of Layla, intimate and sacred. "I need to tell you both something," Omar began, his voice unsteady in a way Daniel had never heard. He gestured for them to sit, but remained standing himself, as though he needed movement to push the words out. "Emma, Daniel, you saved my life. Not metaphorically, literally." Daniel started to protest, but Omar raised his hand. "Please, let me finish." He drew a shaking breath. 3 years ago, after Layla and Amira died, I made a decision. I would go through the motions until I couldn't anymore, and then I would dissolve everything. The foundation, the business, all of it. I would disappear into my grief because I couldn't see any reason to continue. His voice cracked. The day we met in that coffee shop, I'd already decided. After I rejected those Americans and their project, I was going to begin the process of shutting down my life's work. I'd written letters, made arrangements. I couldn't see meaning in anything anymore. Emma had gone very still, hope clutched against her chest, her gray eyes wide and glistening. Omar knelt before her, tears now flowing freely down his face. Then you spoke to me in Arabic. You said the words my grandmother taught me, the comfort I'd forgotten. You told me about your mama learning my language to understand hearts. You showed me hope. His voice broke completely. You reminded me that life continues, that love remains, that grief and hope can coexist. You were 6 years old and you understood something I'd forgotten. He turned to Daniel, still kneeling, vulnerable in a way that transcended wealth and status. You showed me that strength isn't about wealth or power. It's about showing up every day for the people you love, about maintaining dignity and kindness when everything is falling apart. You taught me that grief doesn't excuse us from living. The room was silent, except for the sound of 3 people crying. 3 hearts breaking open together. Omar stood, wiping his eyes, and moved to his desk where documents waited in a leather folder. I've restructured my foundation. It will be called the Layla and Sarah Foundation, honoring both our wives, both women who believed in kindness and understanding across all divides. He opened the folder, his hands steadier now that he'd moved from emotion to purpose. It will support single parents, provide education assistance, childcare, housing support, medical care, everything families need to survive and thrive when they're struggling alone. Daniel listened, confused about why Omar was telling him this now. The night before a grand opening Daniel was already nervous about. Then Omar turned to face him directly. I want you to run it, not just manage it. Lead it, shape it, make it everything our wives would have wanted. You'd have full authority over programs, hiring, direction. The salary would be substantial, the impact immeasurable. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He shook his head slowly. Omar, I'm not qualified for something like that. I'm a project manager, barely. I don't have nonprofit experience. I don't have the education or the background. Something that important needs someone with credentials, with experience. Omar's expression was firm, almost fierce. You're exactly qualified. You've lived it. You understand what families need because you've needed it. You know the desperation, the exhaustion, the impossible choices, and you have something I need to learn, something more valuable than any credential. His voice softened. You never lost your kindness despite your pain. You raised Emma to understand compassion when you had every reason to become bitter. That's what this foundation needs. Not someone with a resume, someone with a heart that still works. Emma had been listening quietly, processing in the way children do, and suddenly interrupted with a question that cut through all the adult complexity to the simple truth underneath. Are you going to be like family? She asked Omar directly, her voice clear and certain. Both men were caught completely off guard, turning to look at her. Omar slowly knelt to her level, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. Would you like that? Emma nodded with the solemn gravity children bring to profound moments. You need a soup friend, and we need someone who understands sad happy. That's what family is. She looked between the 2 men with absolute confidence in her logic. Real family isn't just blood. Daddy told me that. It's people who show up and stay. Omar felt something click into place. Some final piece of his broken heart finding where it belonged. He looked at Daniel, saw the same realization dawning on the other man's face. It was decided then, not through business contracts or professional agreements, but through a child's wisdom that saw past all the complications to the essential truth. They were becoming family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by grief shared and healed together, by hope rebuilt from ruins. The grand opening was triumphant under a November sky, so blue it looked painted. Hundreds of people gathered to celebrate what compassion could build when given resources and vision. Families received keys to apartments with real kitchens and safe bedrooms, parents crying as they signed leases they could actually afford. Children raced through the new school's bright hallways, their laughter echoing off walls that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. The medical clinic opened its doors with doctors who'd volunteered specifically for this mission, understanding that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. Daniel stood beside Omar on the small stage, watching Emma play with other children in the new playground, her blue dress flying as she pumped her legs on the swings, and felt Sarah's presence so strongly he could almost hear her laugh on the wind. The project was everything they'd hoped, everything their wives would have championed. But it was the private moment afterward that mattered most, when the crowds had thinned and the press had departed. Omar led Daniel and Emma to the community center's dedication wall, where he'd arranged something special without telling them. 2 brass plaques hung side by side, polished to a mirror shine. The first read, "In loving memory of Layla Al-Rashid, whose vision of kindness and community inspired this foundation, and whose belief that compassion transcends all boundaries lives on in every family we serve." The second read, "In loving memory of Sarah Cooper, whose love of language and culture taught her daughter to bridge divides, and whose spirit of understanding guides our mission to learn each other's hearts." Emma traced her mother's name with small fingers, her touch reverent and gentle, then looked up at her father and Omar, her 2 protectors, the men who'd found each other through her innocent wisdom. "Mama would like this," she said softly. "Both our mamas would." Daniel and Omar exchanged glances, an understanding passing between them that transcended any words either language could provide. 2 men brought together by loss, rebuilt by hope, guided by a 6-year-old girl who understood with perfect clarity that grief is not the opposite of joy but its companion, that love doesn't end when someone dies, but transforms into something that lives forever in the hearts of those left behind. And so a chance encounter in a coffee shop, a dropped teddy bear named Hope, and a few carefully practiced words in Arabic changed 3 lives forever and created something that would change thousands more. Daniel Cooper found not just employment but purpose, transforming his pain into service that would help countless families avoid the desperation he'd known. Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid rediscovered his heart, learning that closing ourselves off from grief also closes us off from life, that walls built to protect us from pain also trap us in isolation. And little Emma, wise beyond her 6 years, showed them both that hope isn't about forgetting sorrow, it's about choosing kindness anyway, about keeping our hearts open even when they break, about learning each other's words so we can learn each other's hearts. Her mother's legacy lived on not in fluent Arabic, but in a child's understanding that love transcends language, culture, and even death itself. The Layla and Sarah Foundation would go on to serve over 2,000 families in its first 3 years, providing housing, education, medical care, and most importantly, dignity to those society had forgotten. But its true founding happened in that moment when a teddy bear rolled across polished marble toward an expensive shoe. When a grieving billionaire heard his dead wife's wisdom spoken by a stranger's child, when 2 widowers recognized their shared humanity across every divide of wealth and status. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most profound truths. Sometimes strangers become family, not through blood, but through the choice to show up. And sometimes, just sometimes, an angel speaks through a child to remind us that we're never truly alone in our grief or our hope, that kindness is indeed a language everyone understands, and that the legacy we leave isn't measured in dollars or buildings, but in the hearts we touch and the love we choose to give, even when the world has taken everything from us. And so a chance encounter, a dropped teddy bear, and a few words in Arabic changed 3 lives forever. Daniel Cooper found not just employment but purpose, transforming his pain into service. Sheikh Omar Al-Rashid rediscovered his heart, learning that closing ourselves off from grief also closes us off from life. And little Emma, wise beyond her years, showed them both that hope isn't about forgetting sorrow. It's about choosing kindness anyway, about keeping our hearts open even when they break, about learning each other's words so we can learn each other's hearts. Her mother's legacy lived on, not in fluent Arabic, but in a child's understanding that love transcends language, culture, and even death itself. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most profound truths. Sometimes strangers become family. And sometimes, just sometimes, an angel speaks through a child to remind us that we're never truly alone in our grief or our hope.